Greetings, it's me, Mr. Fowler, here for another session of Composition 2 for our Tuesday and Thursday session. I hope that you all had a productive day yesterday on the Veterans Memorial. I hope that if you are a veteran or you know somebody that served, you were able to connect to that person or connect to the larger community and receive the thanks due for that to that individual, or the thanks very possibly due to you for those of you who have served. Now, for today in session 25, we have a bit of a change up. As I suggested during our previous session, I think it would be nice if you had read up to and including chapter 7. But based on the results of your paper writing, I think a number of you have finished the book as a whole. So rather than belabor the ending and have a haphazard week where we're sort of 1 foot toward completion and 1 foot toward planning, I'm going to go ahead and power through today, and we're going to discuss the rest of the novel. So if you've read chapter 7, which was what was the plan for today, you may watch the full video, or you may pause when I start to transition and discuss chapter 8, the final chapter. And then when you get a chance this weekend to read the completion of The Princess Bride, or the rest of chapter 8, the 20 pages making up that final chapter, you can come back, resume the video at that point, and you won't have to worry about getting caught up. You'll be able to finish the book. And for those of you who've already finished the book, well, it'll just be a matter of watching a slightly longer video. Okay, that's the premise. Let me go ahead and get started then, because we don't want to belabor too much additional time, since this might be a slightly longer video presentation or lecture than we're used to. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and you'll have to get along without my image for just a few minutes. But don't worry, my voice will still be here to guide you. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and go to Home and Slideshow from the beginning, of course. So just as always, let's begin with our basic preview and review of what's happening. We're going to go back and touch upon the second half of chapter 6 in preparation for the rest of the paper. Then I'll begin with chapter 7 and we'll go through that chapter's more interesting moments, and I'll try to highlight some of the themes and ideas that I think might make for good potential paper topics. And then I will do the same thing for 8. I will pause for a few seconds before we transition to chapter 8 for those of you who want to pause the video and pick up the process a little bit later once you complete it. Then I'm going to take an additional 15 minutes of your time as a way to preview the argumentative essay and its associated reading, which means for next time, Monday, it's Tuesday, the 17th, I believe, we are going to start thinking and planning about what topic we want to select for the final essay for the semester. So let's get into it. Princess Bride, today, chapter 7 and 8 is our focus. Our story so far is that Wesley has been captured by the sadist Count Rugen and is subjected to the terrors of the Machine. Remember that the Machine is housed in the 5th level of the Zoo of Death, where Prince Humperdinck and Count Rugen, his right-hand man, engage in one of their favorite pastimes, horrendous torture. It's so much of a fascination for Rugen that he even is authoring what's called a primer on pain. This is a little jab at the aristocracy of the Middle Ages, who would set themselves apart from the rest of society as being particularly skilled or learned, and they would write things often called a treatise. Now, not every member of the aristocracy was renowned for their intelligence, but Count Rugen likes to think he's a fairly smart fellow, even though he's really just an expert on pain and torture. During the process, though, Buttercup begins to sleuth the truth. While bragging to her in front of Yellen, his chief of security, he lets it slip that he and Buttercup will be escorted by the Florinese Armada during their honeymoon. And Buttercup says, well, all of them but the 4 fastest ships. Because, of course, Humperdinck had promised to send his 4 fastest ships in each of the cardinal directions in an attempt to catch up to Wesley's ship, the Revenge. He did that so that Buttercup's mind could be at ease that even though Wesley had not come for her as he had promised so far, that he may have fallen out of love with her, and he would be a better alternative to suicide or death. And having been caught in a lie, the prince recognizes that Buttercup's feelings for Wesley are never going to change. And so, in a fury, he grabs her by the hair and forces her into her room, locks the door, and heads down to the Zoo of Death. Or, for those of you who are a little bit more familiar with the film adaptation, remember that the Zoo of Death is the same thing as the Pit of Despair. So the prince is really hot and angry at this point, and so he runs down into the 5th level of the Zoo of Death. And after hearing how great Buttercup's love for Wesley is, sorry about that, he says, not one couple in a century has the chance of being genuinely happy. He says, and so, since your love is so intense, I imagine you will probably suffer as no man has ever suffered before. And he throws the machine to the highest potential level of pain that it can register. Even Count Rugen is shocked by this. He leaps up and says, no, don't send it that high, not to 50. And the scream that issues out of Wesley is heard throughout all of Florin, all over the country of Florin. Right? Buttercup hears it locked in her room. Yellen hears it on his way back outside. Even the brutes in the brute squad pause amidst their frivolity and listen to the horrible sound. And the commoners in the town square freeze in place, which makes it difficult for Inigo and Montoya and Fezzik, the giant, who are following the awful sound to get through the town square. There's a great scene in the film where Andre the Giant uses his boisterous voice and says, everybody move. And of course, they're following the sound of the man in black. But when they arrive within the space of the Zoo of Death, they are confronted with a question. How could the sounds that issued forth from Wesley be the sounds of anyone else? After all, the man in black's true love is marrying someone else. And Inigo Montoya reasons that he alone would have reason to make such awful sounds. Now, as they begin to trek toward the Zoo of Death, there's a fear that begins to grow inside the pit of Inigo Montoya's stomach, which is that they may be already too late. But hope springs eternal, because after all, this is a novel of high adventure and fantasy. And as our good friend the Miracle Max would suggest here, even if Wesley has departed this life, mostly dead is still slightly alive. And that's where we begin our discussion with chapter 7. Okay. So with chapter 7, we open on a scene that's being parodied in this little cartoon here to the right, which I think is kind of funny. In the book, we don't really know what happens to the albino. We assume he is sort of put into a sleeper hold, a kind of move that Fezzik would have known from his days of fighting and wrestling. And that would be very appropriate to the actor of Andre the Giant, of course, having performed for many years in wrestling shows and spectacles and so on and so forth. In the book, it's a little bit different. They follow the sounds of the scream to the grotto behind the Zoo of Death, where the entranceway through the secret tree trunk is located. Stepping out of the shadows, Inigo Montoya holds his blade, and I love the expression here, chasing the albino's Adam's apple as he questions him about the man in black and where he's being held. As soon as he solicits all of the information, Fezzik sweeps him with a sleeper hold. The film adaptation is different in that he is, meaning the albino is held at sword point by Inigo Montoya, who takes him by surprise. He tries to run, but Fezzik's right there, and he resists giving them information. And Inigo says, Fezzik, why don't you jog his memory? And Fezzik just pumps him on the top of the head. And of course, he's laid out. The albino's laid out. And then, as you can see here, he says, sorry, Inigo, I guess I jogged his mind or his memory too hard or too quickly. And so Inigo Montoya has this really wonderful scene where he kneels down and he prays to his father and to the spirit of his father to guide him, to guide his sword. And he ultimately does receive some kind of spiritual guidance that leads him to the tree. And he discovers the secret doorway. And the two friends descend into the Zoo of Death. So the Zoo of Death, while having a pretty great buildup, isn't really all that bad. In fact, it really reads like a dark ride, such as Peter Pan's Flight, or the Pirates of the Caribbean, or Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, if you go back that far. I was so happy to have been able to go to Disneyland, or Disney World rather, the year before Mr. Toad's Wild Ride closed down. It's a wonderful ride, and they've replaced it with a kind of more benign Winnie the Pooh themed ride now. So if you've ever rode Winnie the Pooh's Blustery Day, you have a similar experience. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride it was like nothing else that you can experience now. The painted backdrops and the doors that flew open when your coaster would rocket around. It was great. It was very traditional. So the first two levels aren't very difficult. They're dark, and there's a steep staircase that must be descended. The second level is full of all kinds of caged and dangerous animals, but all they do is offer like scary sounds and growls and stuff like that. Not too much to deter hardened adventurers like Inigo Montoya and Fezzik. The third level is a little bit difficult, as the two encounter an anaconda snake called an Arabian Garstini. And this takes a bit of work. Fezzik's great strength is necessary here, where and he's scared, but he encourages Inigo Montoya, who's being crushed in the coils of the snake, to offer various rhymes to him. And he wants to find out ways to complete those rhymes, those riddles. And so he uses great strength to crush the snake. Then they're on to the very dark fourth level, where it's so dark they cannot see. Now it's time for Inigo to save Fezzik, just as Fezzik had saved him on the level previously, because Fezzik fears bats from his childhood in Turkey. So they hit the floor, and these giant king bats are flying all around them. And Inigo Montoya remembers being trained by a Scotsman named McPherson. And McPherson said that to be a true master, you have to be able to fight or at least defend yourself in the event that an opponent might gouge out your eyes or kick sand in your face or otherwise make sight difficult. And so he uses the methodologies that McPherson trained him with to combat the giant bats. And he is successful in driving his blade through the hearts of the giant bats. On the 3, 4, on the 5th level, they encounter green speckle recluse spiders, large kind of menacing spiders, which they're able to overcome, but which they both kind of find, equally distressing. And then to the 5th and final level, where the machine is housed. Here they discover, of course, that Wesley is in fact dead and his life has been sucked away by the machine. Inigo's response is relatively interesting. He cares for the man in black, I suppose, but he's mostly interested in his keen mind as providing him with a leader or filling the gap of the leadership role that was left in the wake of the Zini's death. He feels cheated. It's all about his intense focus on getting his revenge on Count Rugen. And so he says, I can't have fought all of these, dire animals and made my way through the dangerous zoo of death only to find that the man in black is dead, especially when I'm so close to getting my revenge. So, of course, he says, it's not over yet. There's always the miracle Max. Now, we've been hearing about this character since way back in chapter 3, when Prince Humperdinck is, just after, I should say, Prince Humperdinck is introduced. Miracle Max was the miracle man for King Lotharion, who was fired when he was unable to get King Lotharion speaking clearly again. And we have some questions here because during their discussions about the price and haggling over whether or not they can bring Wesley back to life, there's a curious line that Miracle Max delivers. He drops the line that, the only thing greater than true love is cough drops, which is a line that William Goldman uses, especially when referencing that magical time in which his father first read The Princess Bride to him when he was sick. So I speculate, could Miracle Max represent Goldman's father here? And the evidence is pretty clear that he does, because Goldman's parents were actually named Max and Valerie. Miracle Max's wife is Valerie. And so in a way, this is an homage that Goldman is paying to his parents. There's also a little bit of old world charm, I think, to Miracle Max's banter, which would line up with Goldman's stories about his father being an immigrant. And also a doctor, a physician, if you can dig that. And they said, well, you can't mess up too badly if you decide to help us because Wesley's dead. And at this, Miracle Max jumps into action. He says, dead? Oh, dead, I'm good at that. Bring him in. Inigo and Fezzik need what is called a phantasmagoria. And in order to assemble such a device, modeled after the idea of a golf ball, they have a quick aside where Goldman explains that Fezzik and Inigo have to go out into the woods and gather the various supplies to make the phantasmagoria. And while interesting, Goldman speculates that his father wanted to speed the action up a little bit, so he skips the long and laborious descriptions of how they gather the ingredients. Besides, they're magical ingredients, and it's not like it's going to make a whole lot of sense anyway, so he just decides to edit that out. And he tells a rather charming story about anachronisms. And he says that sometimes people have criticized him for creating a character that's a little bit too on the nose in terms of their description, meaning that, like you and I, most of the fans by this point who've been paying attention are going to suss out the fact that there's a more than passing coincidence between the description of the Miracle Max and the attributes that we hear about earlier that describe Goldman's father. And so he says, yeah, well, okay. It may seem a little bit anachronistic or anachronistic. That, in other words, it may not seem to jibe up in terms of time frames. And he tells, like I said, this charming story about being on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where Butch Cassidy says, I have vision, and the whole rest of the country is wearing bifocals. And a producer said, that can't stay in the script. Bifocals weren't invented there. Goldman goes to all the trouble to point out that when these guys were running around in the Old West in the 1890s, the World Series was being played. Ben Franklin, by the way, had invented bifocals years ago. His grandmother was still alive, and his grandmother also wore bifocals. And so he explains that the man did realize that he was wrong. They shook hands, and as Goldman says, they parted as enemies. So Goldman's conclusion is that, sometimes life and art imitate one another. And if that creates anachronisms for the sake of art, sometimes it's something we must live with as a readership or as an audience. But I think this raises an interesting question. And this is one of our first two potential paper topics I want to talk about in regards to Chapter 7. This would be an interesting argumentative essay. Does life imitate art? And you could use The Princess Bride as a springboard to get into other famous instances of whether or not life and art imitate one another, or whether it's the other way around. Does art imitate life? And if this is a keen or an idea about which you're particularly keen, we can certainly talk about that. And I think it would make for an excellent argumentative paper topic that would possibly include, or potentially at least include, The Princess Bride, but could be extended to another book or novel or film of your choice. We cut back to Humperdinck and Yellen, who are making preparations for the ceremony, the wedding itself. And this is an interesting moment because Prince Humperdinck, while evil, is described throughout most of the book as fairly savvy, but he gets himself into a bit of a pickle here. He has been slowly planning the murder of Buttercup, and he does so in a really disturbing way. He practices choking sausages or other thick kind of pieces of meat so that his hands will be sufficiently strong enough to strangle her by the neck in their wedding bed. And he has to create an air of possibility that Gilder could be the ones who would pull this off. And to that end, he chastises Yellen, his head of security, and he says, you have to be cautious and double the guard at the balcony, because I have it on good information that the authorities in Gilder may have dispatched assassins who are well versed in climbing. In fact, he says it's well known that Gilder assassins are some of the best climbers in the world. And this takes Yellen completely by surprise. He didn't know that. As far as he knew, he thought the Swiss were the best climbers in the world. And so Yellen surprises Humperdinck and says, I should leave this job because I didn't know anything about this information. And the fact that you know about it before I do suggests that I'm woefully unprepared for this position. And so he tenures his resignation, and Humperdinck gets caught by surprise. He realizes that he, number one, can't get rid of Yellen, and number two, is going to need him around, because after he conquers Gilder, Yellen would be the perfect person to run it for him, to run over, to be the leader of the city in the wake of its conquer by Florin. So, or its conquest by Florin would be more appropriate. Whoops, made a little grammatical slip there. In any event, Count Rugen, he knows, cannot be selected for this job because he's too busy with his pain primer. So he says, Yellen, I reject your 2 weeks notice. I won't have anybody but you. You're such a trusted member. I was just overreacting because of nerves, due to my impending nuptials. And so he's able to retain Yellen and get himself out of that pickle that he had created for himself. Now, our heroes return to the castle proper, and they use Miracle Max's pill. Unfortunately, we get a quick cut back to Max, who reflects on the fact that there will probably only be about 40 minutes of life in the Phantasmagoria. So whatever they have to do is, relegated to about a 40-minute pastime. So Wesley is kind of revived. At first, he can't move at all. Then he, is able to jiggle his head, and this is a sign that Inigo and Fezzik take as a good omen. They say, hey, look, you weren't able to move before, now you can jiggle your head. And we get some great comedic lines as Wesley says, oh, so that you think I'm supposed to be happy that I can jiggle my head? I was dead a few moments ago. They compare notes and assess the assets at their disposal. 100 men guard the gate. And what do they have to ply against this great force? Fezzik's great strength, Inigo's steel, and Wesley's keen mind. And Wesley says, well, that's good. And of course, at some point, I will need a sword. And Inigo says, why? You can barely move. And he says, yes, but not everyone else knows that. Among their other assets, they have the wheelbarrow that the albino had been preparing to dispose of Wesley's body, and a Holocaust cloak that, basically Fezzik stole from Miracle Max's house. They use Wesley's mind and the threat of the dread pirate Roberts, who, remember, not many people have seen. And they put Fezzik up on a wheelbarrow to make his already intimidating size and stature more intense. Then they storm the castle, with draping Fezzik in this great Holocaust cloak, which can stand a lot of damage. And things really get moving when they set him on fire, or more specifically, they set the cloak he's wearing on fire. His booming voice comes into play once again as he says, the dread pirates Robert is here to claim your souls. There will be no survivors. And at this point, even the bravest of the brave begin to wilt. Despite Yellen's commands for them to stand their ground, the brutes decide there's not enough pay being offered for this. And they scatter, leaving Yellen alone to face the results. Okay, so for chapter 8, we begin with this gentleman. And if, like I said, you have not read chapter 8, you may want to go ahead and pause the video here. Take some time today or throughout the weekend to read that chapter and come back here to chapter 8 and walk through the rest of the discussion with me. Because chapter 8 is all about Marriage, of course. All right. I will see you then. Okay. Hopefully, you are back now having read chapter 8, or you're just ready to move on. Chapter 8, of course, is the final chapter and the wrap up to the novel itself. And it's pretty interesting because Goldman already takes a shorter amount of time to reach the story and then infuses it with a really useful pacing device, which is the countdown of the phantasmagoria from chapter 7, the pill that resurrects Wesley. Remember that it's on a 40-minute timer, so things have to evolve fairly quickly. He also ramps up the humor, introducing us to some of the funniest characters. One of the funniest characters in the story, the Archduke, who is both deaf and suffering from a severe speech impediment, much in the line of Elmer Fudd. We get some early humor as well with Yellen and the trio of heroes. Yellen is a pompous official who's basically a coward. He does stand his ground while the paid brutes flee in regard to the burning effigy of the dread pirate Roberts, who's coming to destroy them. But specifically, his cowardice is exposed once the heroes reveal themselves. He's held at Inigo Montoya's sword point, and he asks Yellen for the gate, promising that he will not dispatch him, won't kill him, in other words, if he gives over the key. Yellen plays dumb and says, I have no key. I don't know what you're talking about. And of course, we get this great exchange, which is played word for word pretty much in the film adaptation. And he says, very well, Fezzik, tear his arms off. And then Yellen quickly produces the key. He says, oh, you mean the key to this gate? And the key is, of course, handed over. And the heroes unlock the gate. They are good to their word. They allow Yellen to run away. And they close the gate behind them, locking it so that no one can get out. Because Inigo specifically does not want to risk the chance that Count Rugen may escape him. And then, of course, the Archdean. On one level, we have to talk about this because as society continues to improve, we ask ourselves more urgently whether or not humor has to evolve as well. Now, the Archdean is another character who is an official. He is leading the marriage ceremony, which is a very solemn occasion for the bride and the groom most of the time, and for the parties who are witnessing the event. There's a great sense of reverence here. So in that way, the fact that his speech impediment kind of gets things off to a humorous start in chapter 8 is understandable, right? Because if someone's standing up there with all of the official raiment and, the bride and the groom are tense, we as an audience know that there's special tension between Buttercup and Humperdinck, and the audience is still kind of, on edge. King and queen are gathered. All of the things that are supposed to be happening are happening. Plus, while this is going on, we jump backward in time. And we explain that the wedding starts at 5:27 p.m. and ends at 5:31. So a pretty short wedding ceremony. And if you've ever sat through a wedding or if you've been married yourself, you know that it is a lot longer than 5 minutes, okay? Oh, wait, 27, 28, 29, 30, 30, yeah, 5 minutes. So something the comedic setting is already primed for us as an audience. And then this solemn official steps up and he says, marriage, marriage is what brings us together here today. And as he keeps talking, marriage is a dream within a dream. Now, okay, on one level, that's just humorous because of all of the circumstances building around the moment, including the screams of terror from the brute squad as the heroic trio makes their way into the castle. But is it funny, really? There's a sense that today, some of the traditional methods that we use to celebrate humor, like mockery, like humorous off-color comments, that sort of humor is under fire right now. And I'm not trying to say that that's right or that's wrong. I'm just trying to point out that The Princess Bride comes from an era where that was very much still in vogue. And it doesn't seem like that long of a time ago, but as society keeps moving forward, humor has become a very difficult subject to tackle because what was once now funny. Some of the most celebrated comedies, the work of Mel Brooks, the work of characters like Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, and even people, contemporary comedians today like Bill Burr and Dave Chappelle. People are starting to say, their kind of humor is too antiquated. It's not the same sort of humor that we find appropriate today. Your mileage on that concept may vary, but I think it's an interesting potential topic that's worthy of argumentation, and one in which you could use the Princess Bride or a character like the Archdeacon as a springboard to talk about whether or not that type of comedy is still appropriate today. Certainly the kind of warts and all, hoist upon your own petard comedy like we see with Yellen as a pompous official is still relatively humorous. But when you get into personal issues about a character's dialect or the way in which they speak, then I think we now pause as an audience, as a society, and we ask, is this something that's worth laughing about? Now, again, your mileage on that topic may vary. You may be rolling your eyes and saying, Mr. Fowler, I don't want to talk about that. What's funny is funny, and that's it. But the political correctness of humor is something that I think a lot of people feel strongly about, or I think touches a lot of us. And that may be a very debatable topic that might lend itself to a good paper, an issue in which you feel strongly, in which expressing your points and actually reflecting on your ideas in a deep manner might not only be a healthy and thoughtful process to go through just as a person, but like I said, might lead to an invigorating and challenging paper that would be worthy of your time and attention. Okay, let's move ahead. So like I said about the timing device, the opening of the chapter starts at around 5:30 and takes about 4 minutes. That's the introduction with Yellen and the sort of confrontation. Then we flash back to the ceremony, which began at 5:27 p.m. and ends at 5:31. And then we realize that during the ceremony, the screams of the brute squad encourage Humperdinck to nod at or make a gesture toward his right-hand man, Count Rugen, once again. And Rugen is dispatched with a cadre of soldiers to go and investigate what's happening. And Rugen just happens to arrive a few minutes after the wedding ceremony, about 5 minutes, 6 minutes after the wedding ceremony has wrapped up. He arrives at the front gate only to be met by our heroic trio. He seems to regard Inigo Montoya, and he seems like he recognizes him, but he says nothing. He sends the troops to dispatch the trio, but the 4 guards that advance are met with Inigo Montoya's incredible skill and the power of the 6-fingered sword, and he dispatches all 4 of them relatively quickly. And at that point, he once again confronts Count Rugen, as you see over here on the right-hand side of the screen. And he gives him the official speech, okay, which you can see printed here. Count Rugen surprises him by turning heel and running away through a locked door. This causes the breakup of the trio because Wesley, again, is too weak to walk under his own power. So Fezzik has to end up putting him down and going over to help Inigo break a door down. He does so, and Inigo continues his pursuit of Count Rugen. When Fezzik goes back to retrieve Wesley, Wesley's gone. And so Inigo is Fezzik is faced with the challenge of selecting one of 3 different doors. And as they suggest in the novel, Fezzik chooses a door and, as per his usual luck, chooses the wrong door. It's actually a path that leads him downstairs and outside. So in this 40 minutes, a lot happens in the text that seems hard to believe. And, from the time that the castle is stormed at about roughly 5:30 to the conclusion of the process, the whole thing is it's about, what do they say? It starts at 5:30 and ends just before 6 o'clock, so about 40 minutes. Now, that might seem unrealistic, but if you compare the action in this last scene to the action that you might see in a typical professional sports event, such as a football game or an inning in baseball, or even 40 minutes in a basketball game, a lot can happen. Football is an especially good comparison because 40 minutes is that's almost, 2.5 quarters worth of play, I think. Or maybe that's, of course, play is extended by timeouts and so on and so forth. But I think most, it's almost like an entire football game of time on a clock. So there's a lot that can occur in those moments, in that brief span of time. However, the manipulation of how that time is spent is very reminiscent, I feel, of the way scenes are manipulated and composed into a film. Okay. All right. So we do get the revenge with Count Rugen, right? What does that mean for Inigo Montoya? He is stabbed by Rugen, who throws a dagger at him nefariously. But his strength, his commitment to his father seems to invest him with some sort of supernatural ability. And once he kills Rugen, he now has this sense of sort of, post-homicidal depression or something. The film actually suggests that he might take over the role of Dread Pirate Roberts now that Wesley and Buttercup have been reunited. But I ask you as an audience, this is a problem. What is he going to do now once he has avenged his father's death? Of course, in the meantime, we do find out what happened to Wesley. From 5:48 to 5:55, he has slipped away to Buttercup's room, where she was about ready to contemplate suicide, and he stops her, suggesting that to do so would mean the loss of one of the world's great beauties. They reunite, and Wesley, of course, is still a little bit injured, so he's like, be gentle, be gentle. Great, which I thought was just wonderfully humorous. And that's what we've been waiting for. That's the thrust of the entire novel as it's evolved since chapter 3 up until the end of the book. But Prince Humperdinck is still alive, and we got a spoiler for this in chapter 6. We knew that Humperdinck was going to live, but again, Goldman tempers our expectations because Wesley challenges Humperdinck to a duel to the pain, meaning he will gouge his eyes out, sever all of his 4 major limbs, and then go ahead and cut out his tongue, leaving only his perfect ears to hear the horrible shrieks and catcalls of children who would react to his deformity. And so there's a great suggestion here. There's a moment when you're reading the novel. Now, a lot of us have seen the film, so we know what the spoiler is, but there is a moment of tension where it's like, leaving Humperdinck alive but in immeasurable torturous pain, that might be worthy of revenge. But Wesley's even kinder than that, and more to the point, he realizes that Humperdinck may be a great hunter, but when forced into a person-to-person confrontation, is a man of his own era and breeding, which suggests that he would probably be loath to go through life like that, or even risk such potential. And so he bluffs, and which is also another parody thing, to blove or to bluff, as the Miracle Max suggests. And he is tied to a chair. Buttercup ties him up to a chair. And this leaves another sour note in our mouths because he's still alive at the end of the novel. And they even explain in the book that Yellen and the brutes can hear him screaming as everybody escapes. And so they go and save him. They untie him, and he's able to pursue them as the book comes to a conclusion. But at last, the one I like the best, which is Fezzik. And of course, Fezzik is successful. He does something right for the first time in his life. And that is that he follows the stairway down to the exterior of the castle by the stables. And there he finds, of course, the 4 white stallions that he gathers together and brings to the window of Buttercup's chamber. But as they suggest, as specifically Goldman suggests, no one stays on top forever. And even though Fezzik's fate is relatively perfect, even Fezzik will eventually lose a fight. And you can see Andre the Giant here. Yes, that is President Donald Trump, flanked by the Hulk Hogan, the guy who would successfully defeat Andre the Giant and take his title. So there's always somebody coming along who's better. Of course, Inigo meets up with Wesley and Buttercup, and they all leap onto one of the 4 stallions that Fezzik has delivered. Buttercup uses her station as queen to have the brute squad clear the gates and lower the drawbridge, and the 4 of them ride off into the sunset happily ever after. But does the ending satisfy? Our characters do get what they want. Fezzik feels like a hero. Buttercup and Wesley are reunited, and Inigo avenges his father. But there's still an expectation that maybe things are being wrapped up too easily here. we cut back to the final aside in which Goldman gives us his reaction. Father said they rode off and they lived happily ever after. And young Billy says, wow. And his father kind of puts the book down, looks at him, and he says, you're not pleased? And, Billy says, no, it's just the ending came really quickly and it surprised me. I thought there'd be a little more. Is the pirate ship waiting for them? Or is that just a rumor? And all that his father says is, if you don't like it, complain to Mr. Morgenstern. And they lived happily ever after is how it ends. But of course, Goldman can't leave well enough alone. He explains that when he was preparing the, this image cracks me up. When he was preparing the version for Jason, that Morgenstern's ending was actually a little bit more grim. And it presents the reader with a lady or the tiger situation. So if you don't get that metaphor, the lady and the tiger is a reference to a short story in which the fairy tale setting is once again a kingdom ruled by a semi-barbaric king, if you can dig that, a semi-barbaric king. And this guy has employed some, I guess you could say, slightly progressive measures to mete out justice. So he says that justice should be left up to chance, not the whims of man. And he devises a situation where criminals, rather than being brought to trial, are brought to an arena. And they're presented with an arena that offers them two doors. Behind door number one is a woman or a man, depending if the woman was a criminal. But in this story, it's principally males who are criminals, just for your edification. So behind one door is a lady, someone caring and a match for the criminal in question, or someone that the king deems to be a match for the criminal in question. And behind the other door is a man-eating tiger. And the decision is left up to the criminal or on trial, or in the situation. Either they open the door and are forced to marry the person on the other side, no matter who it may be that the king deems is appropriate for them, or they're forced to face the man-eating tiger. The situation in the story is that, of course, someone falls in love with his daughter. And the king does not believe he is a match for his daughter, so he forces him into the arena. The princess, though, intervenes and discovers which door the tiger is in and which door the potential wife is in. But she's surprised because her father, like the story suggests, is invariably cruel. And her father has placed behind the door opposite of the tiger a woman that the princess believes to be her rival, and one that she personally knows had been a former love interest of the doomed prince. And the story concludes without us knowing, without the audience, the reader knowing which door he chooses. We do know that the princess meets with him long enough to give him a hint, and she says that you should select the door to the right. Now, we do not know what's waiting behind the door to the right. Has she, in her anger, decided, you know what, better to you to be eaten alive if you can't be with me than to be with that other woman? Or does she really love him? And has she given him the right door, which will reveal his former lover that he will be committed to marrying? Maybe his happiness is more important to her. We just don't know. And the author, R. Stockton, who wrote the story in 1882, never really gave the answer away. That's part of the pleasure, so to speak, of reading the book. So According to William Goldman, the original Morgenstern ending is a little bit more of a Lady of the Tiger situation. Humperdinck is freed by the brutes from the brute squad and actually gets up onto a horse and is chasing the heroes through the gates of the Florin castle as they escape. Inigo's wound reopens due to the rough riding that's required, and Buttercup's horse throws a shoe. So there is a potential that there is no great solution to the story. And this is often true of a lot of fairy tales and adventure stories. There's typically an original, dark, and cruel version and a more classical, hopeful version. It's a bit benign or a bit more benign in its iteration, right? So in the original Red Riding and Goldilocks stories, those two girls are killed and eaten. In the more classical version, the woodman saves Red, and Goldilocks is chased out of the house. The Pied Piper of Hamelin leads all of the children away, and they disappear and are never seen again in the original version. Whereas the classics version at least offer us some hope, because there's one blind child and one deaf child who lose their way in the trek out of town and survive to repopulate the civilization. In Rapunzel, Rapunzel's hair is shorn off. She's thrown out of the castle by the evil stepmother or witch, and the prince falls out of the window and into thorn bushes which gouge out his eyes. So he's left blind and in agony, and Rapunzel is thrown into the waste with her beautiful hair, severed. In the slightly more classical version, Rapunzel survives and her hair grows back, and she even has 2 children. And later, the prince, still blinded though, which kind of sucks for him, the prince meets her again, and he adopts her 2 children, and they live happily ever after. And the witch, for her trouble, or the evil stepmother, depending on which version it is, she chases the prince out, and he falls into the thorn bushes. He's still blinded, but on his way down, he clutches at the hair, and it's dragged off of her head. And now the witch or stepmother herself has no way to escape the tower, and she dies of starvation, and she's unable to escape. So there's a little bit more, dark justice that's offered up in that one. But the point is that you can take a look at the classics versus the darker or more original iterations and see that this is pretty commonplace. So you have the film adaptation, which ends with the happily ever after conclusion, and that's certainly offered up here. But you also have a situation where, life may not work out as perfectly for these characters as you thought. Goldman suggests such a response, and he says, eventually some new kid is going to come along and challenge Inigo Montoya to a duel, and he'll win. And someday Fezzik will eventually lose a fight. And Buttercup's looks may fade, and she may bicker with Wesley, just like her parents did. And Wesley may never be able to sleep well and may be constantly on edge because Humperdinck is alive and out there somewhere. And all of those consequences could come to pass. They most certainly do in real life. But he does offer us one last interpretation here. Life, he says, isn't fair. And we know that this has been an idea that he introduced earlier in the novel. But he says it is better than death. And that's the only promise that we get in this life. And so the reading of this text along the lines of the 1973 iteration do offer us some sense of balance or hope, in so much as that, life isn't often what we expect it to be, but it's often much better than we anticipate that it can be. Okay, now you have to face a more difficult question. What in the world are you going to write about? Well, that's where I would like to bring in another discussion. So you do have the two choices that I brought up in the course of today's discussion. You could write about humor and how humor changes as a society evolves. That could be used as a springboard from our discussions over The Princess Bride, but it doesn't have to be exclusively based on that. You might also alternatively spin off and talk about the other topic that we mentioned, which is that does the idea that life isn't fair adequately sum up the thesis of the novel? Now, you wrote about that as a response question last week, so that may be a nice primer or sort of pre-writing activity that you could use to reflect on and then address as the beginning of the next paper assignment, if you're so inclined. But what are some of the other options, and what exactly is the goal of this essay project? Well, we're going to find that out right now. So this argument essay, as you can see, is weighted about in the same level or degree as our persuasive essay, which we completed a couple of weeks ago. Can you believe it's already like 2 weeks since you completed that? Yeah, no. Time moves quickly. So this essay will be due the Friday of our last full week of class. You may, of course, turn it in earlier, but it will not be due until that Friday. I want to give you the maximum amount of time to do the best potential work that you can. So that just seems fair. It will be evaluated at another 100 points and will scale in about 1,250 words. Now, 1,000 words is about 4 full pages. So I've included a tilde here. 250 words seems to suggest a 5th full page, but even if it's not a 5th full page, once you add in the context for the works cited page or resources page, if you prefer APA style, you'll be clocking in at about 5 pages. The format is the same as we've seen all semester long, with my caveat that this time you employ 4 sources documented in a works cited or references page in appropriate MLA or APA style. That means you'll have to cite those instances both in the text itself parenthetically and as a bibliographical entry at the end. But what is the actual assignment asking you to do? In this assignment, you'll demonstrate your ability to develop a thesis that is a direct response to another author's ideas and present your thesis using persuasive claims and support while following the structure of a college-level argument. Now, you do have the option here to shape this assignment around your personal interests, meaning that your thesis will be a result of your own thinking and logic, and the end product will reflect a mastery of persuasive structure and strategies that you apply throughout your academic and professional career. The paper should synthesize the research that you learned about in your lecture material while taking a distinct stance on a topic or issue, or perhaps even encouraging your reader to take some sort of action. Again, you should review at least 4 articles in preparation for the essay. So while it's relatively open-ended, I did want to just conclude by broaching some possible topics related to The Princess Bride. Some of you may want to create a thematic arc for this semester and incorporate Princess Bride material. And some people just don't like an open-ended assignment. They like some direction. So I prepared a couple of potential topics for you. The first 2 are sort of reflective options. You could revisit your ad analysis paper and the idea of your analysis of the original poster for the film adaptation of The Princess Bride. Then complete a simple Google Images or Pinterest search and compare the foreign release posters or even new posters and ad campaigns designed around the film. You might want to start by asking yourself, what is new or what's different about those versions? What visual cues or images get added? And how do these new versions appear superior or at least different? Now, option 2 is the easiest option. And I think anybody who says, Mr. Fowler, due to, the advancement of COVID and the relative amount of time we have left and the other requirements that are placed upon me by some of my other courses, I just want the most quick, I just want the simplest prompt that I can be given to complete this assignment. No offense to you or to anybody else. And I totally appreciate that perspective. That's usually where I found myself as a student writer. And I think this is the easiest option you could invest your time and energy in, which is B. Despite Goldman having written the screenplay for the film adaptation, there are many differences between the novel and the film. Identify as many of these differences as you can. Why do you feel that Goldman made those changes? And with which of his choices do you agree? And with which do you disagree? So basically a comparison contrast essay comparing the film adaptation and the book. C. You could also compare and contrast the relationships between men, such as the relationship between Goldman and his father, Fezzik and Inigo and his father, Domingo, and Goldman and his fictional son, Jason, to those between men and women, specifically Wesley and Buttercup. Which of the two types of relationships are presented more positively, and why do you think that is? Lastly, it's often said that those on the path of vengeance should dig 2 graves, one for their victims and one for themselves. Based on this adage, I would ask you to reflect on Inigo Montoya and his quest for revenge. Do you think that old adage applies to him? And if so, what types of things or parts of life does Inigo potentially miss out on due to his quest for vengeance? Or as it says here, what does he miss out on as he pursues his vengeance? So those are some potential topics that I think would lend themselves to a very good paper or a very good argumentative style paper for this final essay. So when we get together on Monday next week, I will have some pre-writing strategies for you to try out, some ideas for you to think about, and we'll start in on writing labs. So we'll have some writing labs Monday. So we'll have a half class. I'll still have a session, and then the rest of the time will be a writing lab. Then Wednesday will be a full writing lab next week. So a week from today, a full writing lab. And then the following Monday, which is the beginning of Thanksgiving week, you will have another full writing lab. Then on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I don't know how realistic it is of me to expect that you will be able or even interested in a writing lab. All I can offer you is my time for conferencing. So I'll be available and I'll go live on Thursday. I won't be on Thursday. I'll go live on Tuesday with you next week if you want to meet with me. And then the week after that is the countdown week to the due date for this essay. So we're where we are in the semester. We're ready to sort of start wrapping things up and thinking about designing our final essay. I hope that this has been interesting, and I've loved hearing about your comments and reading your reflections in your weekly discussion questions. I think we'll have time for one more weekly discussion question before the end of the semester. But this has been a lot of fun for me. I hope it's been at least interesting for you or compelling in some way, shape, or form. But until next time, this is Mr. Fowler signing off, bidding you good health and good rest and a wonderful and consistent pursuit of knowledge. Okay, until next time, take care, everybody.